That might have seemed like a strange string of readings, but we're going to tie them together. And in order to do that, first, we are going to start with Luke 4, with Jesus. This is at the beginning of his public career. And he had already started gaining fame. He was healing people, he was performing miracles, and he was teaching. And so a buzz was going around about him. He's maybe like the first viral kind of thing or whatever. And in the reading in Luke 4, he comes to his home congregation. This is his hometown. It's very likely this is the synagogue he grew up in. Now, it wasn't specifically in the reading that we heard, but at this point, he's this famous guy, and it was customary to have somebody read from the Bible at every synagogue meeting. And if you ever were curious, that's why we do that today. It was because they did it in the synagogues. And so, hey, we've got our son of the congregation. He grew up. We watched him grow up, and he is famous now. He is teaching, performing miracles. Let's have him do the reading. And so he takes the scroll and unrolls it and reads it from the prophet Isaiah. And I'll just paraphrase a little bit, but he chose this himself. And it was, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, to proclaim freedom to the captives, good news to the poor, sight for the blind," and so on and so forth. And then when he rolled it up, he kind of upped the ante. He said, "This is now happening today through me." I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but that's the force of it. So now the people are in awe, and it says like their eyes followed him as he went to sit down, because not only is this son of this congregation up and reading, and you can hear like the little old church ladies going, "Oh, that Jesus, he reads so nice," and so on, but now he is upping the ante by saying, "This is about me." So they sit down, or he sits down, and they're all watching, waiting, and anticipating. And Jesus calls them on what they really want. He realizes they want some of that miracle good stuff. Hey, what you did in those other places, hey, Jesus, do some of that here. Lay it on us. And then Jesus says, he's not going to do that. In a very cryptic way, he explains why. He says that in the time of Elijah the prophet, there were many widows in ancient Israel, and a widow in the ancient world was one of the most vulnerable people in society. And there were many people like that who were Israelites, who were the people of God, children of Abraham, the in crowd. But God sent Elijah to the widow of Zarephath, who is not an Israelite, who does not worship the one true God, who has no reason or no business to interface with the very prophet of God. But God chose her. And then he says there were a lot of people with leprosy, a skin disease, and God chose Naaman the Syrian to be healed. The Israelites hated the Syrians, and they were often at war with them. In other words, Jesus is saying that God is doing something different from what you want. God is now acting through me to reach out and save those who we hate, those who do not belong, those who we see as on the margins. The people in his synagogue freak out, because Messiah is evidently here. Jesus clearly thinks he's Messiah, but he's not here just for us. He's here for the world. And so they respond by trying to throw him off a cliff. Seems a little extreme. Now, to really grasp what's going on, we now get to go back to the story with Elijah. There had been a drought and it extended to 3.5 years. Now, we here in Southern California understand droughts a little bit, right? And honestly, like my years of growing up here, and now I've been here for a year, it seems like we're always in a drought, except for last winter. Otherwise, they're always talking about the water tables and how it's terrible and we're all going to die or something like that. But realistically, when we are in a drought, what happens? Well, things dry out as you'd expect, and we could be looking at a very dangerous fire season, which I would never want to downplay. That's serious business. It means that we've got to ration our water, so you don't get to take your 45-minute hot shower or something like that. We don't get to water our lawns, so things don't look as nice. Crops get more expensive to grow because the water then costs more, so food prices go up. That's kind of a drought in Southern California. But in the ancient world, it meant people died. Because without the rains, and the irrigation was mediocre at best, especially in ancient Israel, the crops will eventually fail and people will starve. So as drought and then famine comes along, instead you are wondering who amongst my friends, family, and community aren't going to make it, because there's going to be plenty. So Elijah is sent to this woman, this widow of Zarephath. She is not an Israelite, does not believe in God. And he says to Elijah, I have commanded her to take care of you, which cracks me up because she apparently doesn't get the memo. She didn't know he was coming. And so he shows up and says, I need some water, and then can you make me some bread? So she gets the water, but then she says, look, I've got a little bit of flour, I've got a little bit of oil. I was going to make bread for me and my son. We were going to eat it and then die. That seems a little extreme to me, like, oh man, I'm going to die of starvation. It's like, dude, you just skipped lunch. That's enough. You're fine. But remember, this is the ancient world and it's a drought. This is a very real possibility. And then he makes a promise that my God will supply you with what you need. Those jugs of flour and oil will not run out. And that happens. Now, she apparently doesn't totally trust in what God is doing because, unfortunately, her son falls ill and stops breathing, basically dies. And if you notice, she kind of attacks Elijah. She's like, what are you doing here? And earlier, she called God your God. In other words, he's not my God. So she's like, did you just come to reveal my sin and kill my son? Is this what God is doing? So Elijah takes the son and performs a miracle. He stretches out over her a few times, and then he lives. I have no idea what's going on there in terms of that stretching out. No clue. And then the son lives. And at this point, the widow of Zarephath says, now I know that I can trust what your God is doing. Now, if you think about it and you put yourself in her shoes, that situation where those jugs of flour and oil kind of never run out sounds to me like torture a little bit. Because if she had just enough to make a little bit for them, well, what happens the next day? If she's not really trusting God, that means she's probably wondering, is there going to be any left? Oh, turns out there is. There's enough for today. Then the next day, is there any left? Well, there's just enough for today. That seems like torture, especially if you don't trust this God who is doing this. I mean, if I were her, I would want like the big miracle, the magic trick where a barn shows up and it has 3 years worth of bread, and then I know I'm going to be okay. But not so much for her. God just gives her what she needs day in, day out. And she has to learn to trust. And eventually the big moment comes where her son is brought back to life, and so she finally comes to this moment where she trusts. But here's kind of, this is generally my experience when I read stories of miracles, because as a human being, I tend to be pretty selfish. And I'm guessing you all struggle with that too. It's the human condition. Even the most selfless person will be at least a bit self-absorbed. Because I read about these miracles where God provides people with what they need. And I think, well, what about me? I mean, I've been in need. I've been in a lot of need. I mean, now, obviously, you look at me, I kind of prefer, like, sometimes wearing the robes in our traditional services because they're slimming. But in this case, you can just clearly tell I am not a man who is starving. And the only time I've experienced, quote, starvation was self-inflicted when I was on the wrestling team. But I've been in need in other ways. And I suspect that we have all been there. I was reminded of when I was first diagnosed with leukemia, 12 and a half years ago now. The insurance that I had was like just the bare minimum that you had to have in order for them to let you be a graduate student, which meant it was terrible and covered basically nothing, and it had a relatively tiny lifetime maximum. This was back when you could do that. And at first, I mean, when I was first hospitalized and we were trying to figure out like what treatment was going to look like, and we realized I'm going to blow through this out-of-pocket maximum fast. It was like, what are we going to do? I'm going to go bankrupt. And little did I know, I found out years later that a family member or two were kind of thinking, well, if we have to sell the house, we can maybe make this work, which was like, gulp. And so the dean of students actually got involved, and he gave the insurance company a bit of a phone call because there was some discrepancy in what they were saying they would cover and what they actually were going to cover. And I do not know how that conversation went, but I know I got a very shaky and sad apologetic phone call from the insurance company. They said, well, you misunderstood, whatever that means, and we'll cover this much more. It's like, okay, that's great, that's good. And then I go and start filling the medication, the big like oral chemo type drug, and that was going to cost $700 a month. I mean, we're basically on 1.5 income, small income. We can't afford this. And then working with my oncologist office, we were able to actually get that from the manufacturer for free. Oh, okay, great. But then how am I going to afford all of these visits? I was going to my oncologist 3 days a week. And how am I going to afford the many tens of thousands of dollars that it cost to stay in the hospital while I was stabilized? How is that going to work out? And then as it turns out, Katie, my wife, was in a job where it was like a temporary to permanent sort of thing. She had been doing that for a couple of weeks, and they ended up hiring her. And they offered benefits, actually decent insurance. And the kicker was that insurance start date was listed as when she started as the temporary, which was before I was diagnosed, which meant they had to cover that. They had to cover everything. All of a sudden, that picture got so much better. And then at that point, we're, okay, this is great, but how are we going to afford these premiums? I mean, we were incredibly poor. And then family members, my parents actually stepped in and helped us with the premiums. Now, at any given point, I assure you, I would have loved, my desire was for God to appear, through the clouds or through the accounting sheets or whatever and say, boom, here's a boatload of money. And actually, after I got out of the hospital, we bought a lottery ticket because it was really high that at that point. I was thinking, imagine the press release, cancer patient, seminary student, but I didn't win. That's what I was hoping for. That is all 100% true, by the way. That's what I wanted. I guarantee you that's what the widow of Zarephath would have wanted. But instead, God gave enough just to get through that next hurdle. Just enough flour and just enough oil to make it to the next day. Just enough of the insurance problem solved to get through. Because sometimes God is after our heart and he's after our trust rather than he is interested in solving our problems. Because those times when we are in need, whatever they are, physical, emotional, spiritual, economic, whatever. What if God, the big miracle is that God gives us just enough from day to day, only to find ourselves looking back at how God worked and realize, yeah, that was a miracle. I mean, there's more to that story when I was first diagnosed, and there were several miracles. But it was always just enough to get to the next step. Because when we find ourselves having to deal with that, we find that our trust and our faith in God has to grow. Because God is more interested in our hearts than he is in the big magical miracles. And so as Jesus is there in front of or amongst his home congregation saying that God is actually doing something bigger than any of you can realize, we see this lashing out, this rage in the people. Because to be honest, I was in a dark place myself, and I'm guessing I'm not alone, that we want God to just step in. God, where's the miracle? God, why aren't you doing what I want you to do? But with Jesus, that desire has to die because God has something else in mind. Jesus' congregation had very specific ideas for what God will do. But God's heart was for something bigger and something better. So sometimes those things have to die. And whenever God causes something to die, in its place, he raises something else from the dead. That is, Jesus eventually goes to his death, completely violating the expectations even his disciples had for what Jesus is doing. Instead, when God raised him from the dead, we realize that the darkness in our own hearts dies with him. My prayer for us is that when we encounter times of need, and we all will, that rather than hoping for the big moment where God drops everything into our laps, which may happen, but rather see that God is slowly working to give us just enough for the day, and then the next day, and then the next day. And you will find yourselves looking back and seeing God with you every step of the way, weaving together these stories, because God, among many other things, is an amazing storyteller. And when we encounter these times of need and we get just enough flour and oil to get us through to tomorrow, may we see the opportunity for what it is, a time to grow in our trust, our faith, and our love for God. The realization that Jesus has something else in mind to grow us as more faithful, more trusting followers of the Creator God. And that where those desires and those opinions on what God should do die, I pray that he raises something else up in its place, something more firmly solid, relying on Jesus, the Son of God. Let's pray.